Dad, let's be honest with each other. You nearly burned the kitchen down last month. Left the front door unlocked for 3 days straight. Forgot to eat, and can't even remember people's names. You're not the man you used to be. You need supervision. Right in the middle of my 63rd birthday dinner, my son Kevin intentionally raised his voice, making sure all 12 neighbors could hear every word. His wife then delivered a devastating blow to my pride, patting my hand like I was a child. You should be grateful Kevin still finds time in his busy schedule to care about you, Robert. Grateful? A retired firefighter who spent 30 years rushing into burning buildings to save lives, who built this very house with his own hands, was now being humiliated by his own flesh and blood as a senile old man in front of his friends. But I chose silence. Kevin thought the smart home system they had just installed was meant to monitor this old man. What he didn't know was that the sharpest eyes in the room had already seen right through the sinister plot hidden inside that device. And the very weapon they used to manipulate me would turn into a fatal trap, leaving them completely empty-handed just 3 weeks from now. Stay with me until the very end of this story, because you won't want to miss the mind-blowing twist that nobody saw coming. Drop a comment right now with your city and local time so I can see where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you'll be the first to know how this birthday dinner ended in the ultimate payback. My name is Robert Callahan. Most people call me Bob. I am 63 years old, and I have lived in the same house in Harlan County, Georgia, for 31 years. I was a firefighter for 30 years. I started as a volunteer at 22 and retired as fire chief at 52. After that, I worked part-time at the county emergency management office until Margaret died. And then I stopped working entirely because I could not find a reason to leave the house most mornings. Margaret Callahan died 18 months ago from heart failure. She was 61 years old. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down, who made Sunday dinner for whoever showed up, who kept the house so clean that visitors always assumed we had help. We did not have help. Margaret was just that kind of woman. When she died, the house went silent in a way I had not experienced before. Not the quiet of a Saturday morning when she was still sleeping. A different kind. The permanent kind. The kind that tells you the noise is never coming back. I had one son, Kevin. He was 37. He lived 40 minutes away in a suburb called Millbrook with his wife Tina and their 2 children, Jake and Emma. Jake was 14. Emma was 11. They were good kids. They were the reason I still made the drive to Millbrook for holidays, even when the drive felt longer than it used to. Kevin had always been the kind of man who operated just slightly beyond his means. Let me give you those 3 waves in full, because each one needs to be understood as a decision Kevin made, not a mistake. The first wave, the $15,000 check, was about establishing precedent. Not about the money, or not only about the money. It was about learning whether I would give without questioning, whether I would accept a vague promise of repayment and not follow up, whether gratitude for being needed would override my financial judgment. I gave the check because Kevin sat at my table 3 months after Margaret's funeral and said he needed his father. I interpreted the financial request as a vehicle for something more important: a son trying to reconnect with his father, a family beginning to come back together after grief. Kevin interpreted my response differently. He learned that the combination of family language and financial need, applied to a recently widowed man, produced results. He filed that away. The second wave, the power of attorney, was the structural move. He needed legal authority to do what he was planning. He could not simply take money and risk being detected. He needed a document that would give his actions the appearance of authorization. He also needed it to look like something I had chosen freely, something he had helped me choose, something that came from his concern rather than his scheme. He spent 2 weeks before that Wednesday conversation mentioning in passing, in phone calls and texts, stories about people who had gotten into financial trouble because they had not planned ahead. A colleague's father who had lost his savings to a financial advisor, who had no authorization to act on his behalf. A neighbor's mother whose accounts had been frozen after a medical emergency because nobody had signing authority. Each story was delivered casually, as a thing he had heard, not as a precursor to a request. He was building a context in which the solution, when he offered it, would feel inevitable. By the time he sat down across from me on that Wednesday and suggested the power of attorney, I was already primed to receive it as protective rather than predatory. I signed it because I trusted him. He counted on that trust the way a contractor counts on a load-bearing wall. The third wave was the birthday system. This was the most technically sophisticated move, and the one that required the most preparation. The data bridge device that Earl found had not been assembled that morning. Kevin had commissioned it weeks in advance. He had arranged the installation on the birthday because a birthday created a natural context for an elaborate gift. The smart home system was real and functional and would have appeared legitimate to any casual observer. He needed ongoing visibility into my financial activity because he was making incremental transfers that required calibration. Too large, and the bank's automated fraud detection would flag the transaction. Too small, and he would not make meaningful progress. He needed to see what I was doing, so he could operate in the spaces between my activity. He also needed to know if I discovered anything. The data bridge gave him that. What he had not anticipated was Earl. Earl had been a licensed electrician for 38 years. He had wired half the commercial buildings in Harlan County. He had installed home security systems for 30 years before dedicated security companies took over that market. He could look at a network setup and see what was there and what was not supposed to be there, the way I could walk into a burning structure and know within seconds where the fire was moving and what the building was about to do. Kevin had not accounted for Earl because Kevin had never paid enough attention to my friendships to know who Earl was or what he knew. That was the blind spot that cost Kevin everything. Nice car when the budget said practical car. Nice house when the budget said smaller house. Nice vacations when the budget said stay home. Margaret used to worry about it quietly. She would say to me in the evenings, "Kevin's going to overextend himself one day, and I want to make sure we don't get pulled in." I would say, "He'll figure it out." She would say, "Robert, he will figure out how to make it our problem." She was almost always right about these things. I wish I had listened more carefully. Let me tell you about Margaret, because this story does not make sense without her. Margaret Ellen Callahan was born in Harlan County in 1961. She taught 4th grade for 24 years at Harlan Elementary and retired 2 years before she died. She was the kind of teacher that children remembered 30 years later. I know because they still tell me. I'll be at the hardware store, and someone will say they were in Mrs. Callahan's class in 1989, and their face changes the way faces change when people talk about something that mattered. She kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended with the same methodical patience she gave everything. Tomatoes, green beans, zucchini, peppers. Every summer she canned enough to fill the shelves in the basement and give jars to the neighbors and still have too much. She could not pass someone's house with a porch light out without stopping to mention it. When she got sick, it came fast. A cardiac event in February that we thought was minor. A second one 6 weeks later that was not minor. She died on a Tuesday morning in October, while I was sitting in the chair beside her hospital bed reading the newspaper out loud because she had asked me to keep reading even when she was not fully awake, because she liked the sound. I read her the sports section and the crossword clues and the weather forecast for a week that neither of us would experience the same way. She died at 9:47 in the morning. I drove home. I fed the dog. I sat at the kitchen table until Kevin arrived, which took 4 hours because Kevin had a meeting he needed to finish first. That detail, the 4-hour delay on the day his mother died, I did not store it as evidence at the time. I stored it the way you store things you do not yet know are important. In the back of a room you will need to return to later. The year after Margaret died, I reorganized. I consolidated the accounts. I streamlined. I had spent 30 years as fire chief, which meant I was not a man who left things unexamined or arrangements unchecked. I knew what I had. I monitored it. I was 62 years old and retired, and living alone, and I was careful in all the ways that mattered. What I was not careful about was the specific vulnerability of a man whose family knew him well enough to know which approaches would work. Margaret's death had left me with a specific hunger for family connection that I had not fully identified in myself. Kevin calling felt important. Kevin coming over felt important. Kevin expressing concern felt like something I had not realized I needed until it arrived. That hunger was the door. Kevin was the one who knew it was there. The first wave came 14 months ago, 3 months after Margaret's funeral. Kevin came to the house on a Sunday afternoon without calling ahead. He sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to sit and folded his hands the way he did when he needed something. He had done it since he was a teenager. Hands folded, head slightly down, the posture of a man about to make a reasonable request. He needed $15,000. Business investment opportunity. A partner with warehouse space. The timing was sensitive. He would pay it back in 6 months. I wrote the check that afternoon. He did not pay it back in 6 months. He did not mention it again at all. When I brought it up at Thanksgiving, he said things were still developing, that the timeline had shifted, that he would make it right. Tina looked at her plate when I asked the question. That was the first time I noticed that she already knew the answer was not coming. I did not push. Margaret was 6 months dead, and I did not have the energy to become the kind of father who chased his son over money. I told myself it would sort itself out. That was my mistake. My first one. The second wave came 8 months ago. Kevin called me on a Wednesday evening and said he had been talking to a financial advisor friend who thought I needed better protection for my assets, given that I was now a single man with a significant estate. He said it in those words. Significant estate. Which was generous. I had the house, a pension, and Margaret's life insurance. Enough to live on comfortably. Nothing that required a financial advisor to protect. He said the simplest thing would be a durable power of attorney. Just a legal document that meant if anything ever happened to me, someone I trusted could handle my affairs. He said he had already spoken to a notary who could come to the house. Made it sound like a routine safety measure. The way you talk someone into something by surrounding it with words like protection and simple and just in case. I signed it. I am not a stupid man. But I was grieving. I was 62 years old, and I had spent 18 months learning how to live alone, and my son was sitting across the table from me, speaking in a careful, patient voice. And it felt like someone cared about what happened to me. I wanted that to be true badly enough that I did not read the document as carefully as I should have. I signed it. That was my second mistake. And it was the one that Kevin had been building toward. The third wave was the birthday party. My 63rd birthday. A Saturday in April. Kevin and Tina arrived in the morning with Jake and Emma and a large box that turned out to contain a smart home security system. Kevin spent 2 hours installing it with the focused enthusiasm of a man doing something generous. Cameras at the front and back doors, a smart lock on the main entrance, a connected thermostat, a central router hub in the utility room, and an application on my phone that was supposed to let me see everything in one place. He also, while he was at it, downloaded a secondary application that was connected to my bank account. He said it was for expense tracking. He said it would help me keep an eye on my spending now that I was managing everything alone. He walked me through it on my phone screen, with the patient manner of a man explaining something to someone who struggles with technology. I did not struggle with technology, but I let him explain it because I was watching him with the quiet attention of a man who has spent 30 years reading the behavior of people under pressure. Something about the way Kevin moved through that utility room was too practiced, too sure of where things needed to go. I filed that observation away. That evening, I had 12 neighbors and friends over for a birthday dinner. Margaret's friend Carol brought a casserole. My neighbor, Earl Hutchins, and his wife Helen came early and helped me set up the table. It was the fullest the house had felt since the funeral. Kevin made his speech about supervision and mental decline at 8:15 during dessert, with a glass of wine in his hand, and the easy confidence of a man who believed the audience was on his side. The room stayed quiet for a moment, longer than was comfortable. Then Earl cleared his throat and said he needed to use the restroom and asked if he could get more coffee from the kitchen first. Nobody thought anything of it. But Earl had not gone to the restroom. He had gone to the utility room. Earl Hutchins was 65 years old. He had been an electrician for 38 years and had retired 2 years ago to spend his time fishing and annoying his wife and arguing about sports with me over the fence between our properties. He was the kind of man whose hands were always moving when he talked, always examining whatever was in reach, always slightly more interested in how things worked than in what people were saying about them. He came back to the table 15 minutes later. He sat down. He finished his coffee. He did not say a word until the guests left. At 10 o'clock, I walked the last of them to their cars and came back inside to find Earl in the kitchen washing the remaining dishes without being asked. Helen had already gone home. Earl had stayed. He turned off the faucet. He dried his hands. He looked at me the way he looked at electrical panels that had something wrong inside them. He said, "Bob, that router Kevin installed in your utility room." I said, "What about it?" He said, "There's a secondary device wired into it. Small. Looks like part of the system, if you don't know what you're looking for. But it's not part of the system." He paused. "It's a data bridge. Everything that goes through your home network, your phone activity, your bank app, anything connected to that router, it mirrors to an outside receiver." I sat down at Margaret's kitchen table. Earl pulled a photograph from his pocket. He had taken it with his phone. The image showed the back of a small device attached to the router housing. He said, "I've seen similar setups in commercial security monitoring. But this isn't a commercial setup. This is custom. Someone paid to have this built." I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I looked up at Earl and I said, "How long do you think it's been collecting?" He said, "I can't tell without pulling logs, but based on the battery wear on the secondary unit, my best guess is 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months. The power of attorney had been signed 8 months ago. The $15,000 check had been written 14 months ago. I sat at my kitchen table until midnight. When Earl finally said goodnight and walked home across the yard, I went to Margaret's cast iron skillet that she had left hanging on the wall beside the stove. I had not cooked with it since she died. I just kept it there because taking it down felt like accepting something I was not ready to accept. I touched the handle. The iron was cold and heavy and real in a way that the evening had not felt. I said nothing to Kevin. I said nothing to anyone except the one person I needed. Grace Chen had been my attorney for 14 years. She was 58, sharp in the specific way of people who have been underestimated repeatedly and learned to use that as an advantage. She had handled our wills, our property taxes, the occasional dispute with contractors. She had come to Margaret's funeral and stayed for 2 hours after the other guests left. I called her Monday morning at 8 o'clock and said I needed an appointment. She said, "How serious?" I said, "Serious enough that I want you to know before we meet that I am not certain what I signed 8 months ago." There was a pause. Then she said, "Come in at noon." I brought the copy of the power of attorney document that I had found in my own files. Grace read it in 6 minutes. She set it down. She picked it back up and read it again. Then she said, "Bob, this is a general durable power of attorney with no spending limits, no expiration date, and no oversight requirement. Whoever holds this document has the legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf without your involvement. I said, Kevin. She said, Kevin. She set the document down again. Have you noticed any unusual activity in your bank accounts? I said I had not been looking carefully. She said, I want you to call Tom Willis at First Community Bank before end of business today. Tell him you have a concern and you need to see 12 months of transaction history. I called Tom Willis from the parking lot. Tom Willis was the branch manager at First Community Bank, where Margaret and I had kept our accounts for 22 years. He was 56, careful, methodical, the kind of man who took banking seriously in the way that people take seriously whatever they happen to be good at. He called me back in 4 hours. When he spoke, his voice had the particular careful quality that Grace's had carried. He said, Bob, I need you to come in. I don't want to discuss this on the phone. I went in at 4:30. Tom sat across his desk from me and pulled up a transaction history that he had already printed and highlighted in 3 colors. Over the past 8 months, there had been 47 transfers from my primary checking account to an external account. Each transfer was between $300 and $1,200. No single transfer large enough to trigger automatic fraud alerts. The total across all 47 transactions was $34,220. I looked at the highlighted columns. Tom said, each transfer was initiated through the banking application on your mobile device. Correct authentication, correct device. To the system, they looked like normal activity. I said, Tom, I did not make those transfers. He said, I know, Bob. He set a second page on the desk. A mortgage application. Filed 6 weeks ago. A reverse mortgage on my home. Listed as the applicant. Signed with what was meant to look like my signature. Filed using the power of attorney document as authorization. The requested amount was $180,000. Tom said, the application is pending review. It has not been approved. I put a hold on it this morning when I started pulling your records. I sat in that chair and did the arithmetic that I did not want to do. $34,000 over 8 months. $180,000 pending. The power of attorney as the legal instrument. The smart home router as the monitoring tool. The birthday speech about supervision as the setup for whatever was coming next. Not a son who had made bad decisions and needed help. A son who had made a plan. I drove home and stood in the kitchen for a long time. I looked at Margaret's skillet on the wall. I thought about what she had said to me years ago. Kevin's going to overextend himself one day, and I want to make sure we don't get pulled in. She had been trying to tell me something I had not been ready to hear. The thing about a man who has spent 30 years in emergency management is this. He does not panic. He assesses. He identifies what he knows, what he does not know, and what he needs before he acts. What I knew? $34,000 had been taken. A reverse mortgage application had been filed without my knowledge. The power of attorney gave Kevin legal cover for both. What I did not know, exactly how much he had planned, whether Tina was a full participant or just aware, and whether Kevin intended to keep going, or whether the mortgage approval would be the finishing move. What I needed: documentation of everything, a legal countermove, and time. I spent the next week with Grace every morning, and Tom Willis every afternoon. Grace filed an immediate revocation of the power of attorney. Under Georgia law, a power of attorney can be revoked in writing at any time by the principal. We prepared the revocation documents, had them notarized, and filed copies with the county register, First Community Bank, and every financial institution I had accounts with. Tom put fraud alerts on every account. He also began preparing documentation of the 47 transfers for law enforcement referral, which under Georgia's elder abuse statutes could constitute financial exploitation of an elder, a felony. On Wednesday of that week, Grace called me with something additional. She said, I had my paralegal pull the mortgage application. The application includes a physician's letter. I said, what kind of physician's letter? she said. A letter from a Dr. Marcus Ellison stating that you have shown signs of early cognitive decline and that oversight of your financial affairs is medically advisable. She paused. Bob, I looked up Marcus Ellison. He's not a geriatric specialist. He's a general practitioner. His office is in Millbrook. Millbrook, where Kevin lived, I said. Kevin's personal physician, Grace said. Almost certainly. And based on the letterhead and formatting, I don't believe you were examined by this doctor at any point. This letter was written based on Kevin's characterization of your behavior. The birthday speech about burning the kitchen and leaving the door unlocked. Kevin had not been making a public observation about his father's decline. He had been building a documented record, witnesses at a dinner party who had heard him describe specific incidents, a physician's letter based on those descriptions, a power of attorney as the legal instrument, a reverse mortgage application as the financial extraction, the smart home router as the ongoing monitoring tool to make sure I did not notice before everything was in place. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Grace back and said, "How soon can you be ready?" The week I spent with Grace and Tom was the most focused I had felt since retiring. Grace's office was on the second floor of a building on Main Street that she had occupied for 22 years. She had a coffee maker that she kept in the corner and used constantly and offered to everyone who came in regardless of whether they wanted coffee. She offered it to me 3 times during our first meeting that week. Each time I said yes, because the coffee was good and because sitting across from Grace with a cup of coffee felt like the closest thing to having a plan. She was precise in the way that very good lawyers are precise. She did not speculate. She told me what she knew, what she thought was likely, and what she could not determine without more information. In that order, without mixing the categories. On our third meeting that week, she said, "The physician's letter troubles me most." I said, "More than the mortgage application," she said. "The mortgage application is fraud. The physician's letter is fraud that involves a third party. Either Dr. Ellison examined you and is willing to falsify his conclusions, which is a medical ethics violation with serious professional consequences, or he did not examine you at all and wrote a letter based on a family member's description, which is potentially criminal misrepresentation." I said, "Kevin told me at the birthday party that I nearly burned down the kitchen." Grace said, "Yes. And based on what you've described, he has told that story and variations of it to multiple people, including, apparently, Dr. Ellison, in a way that constructed a picture of cognitive decline that has no basis in medical examination." She paused. "When was the last time you saw a physician?" I said, "Annual checkup in January. Clean bill of health. My blood pressure is slightly high, which Dr. Randall has been monitoring for 2 years." Grace said, "I'm going to request a copy of Dr. Ellison's letter and compare it to your January records. I want to know what clinical basis he claims for his conclusions." She obtained the letter 3 days later. She called me that evening. She said, "The letter references memory lapses, difficulty with daily tasks, episodes of confusion, and poor judgment in financial matters. It states these observations are consistent with early-stage cognitive impairment and that oversight of financial affairs is medically advisable." I said, "He wrote that without examining me." She said, "He has no clinical records documenting any of those symptoms because he has never examined you. The letter is based entirely on reported behavior from a third party, your son, which he presents as clinical observation. That is not a physician's letter. That is a character statement from a biased source dressed in medical language." I said, "Can we prove it?" She said, "Your January records show no cognitive concerns. If we request a formal neurological evaluation from a board-certified specialist, which I recommend doing regardless, and the results are what I expect them to be, then the contrast between those results and Ellison's letter will be extremely difficult for anyone to explain." I scheduled the neurological evaluation for the following Tuesday. The specialist, Dr. Patricia Moore, at Harlan County Medical Center, conducted a 2-hour assessment. Her written report stated that I demonstrated normal cognitive function across all measured domains, consistent with a healthy man of my age and professional background, with no indicators of early-stage impairment. I had the report in my hands 48 hours before the Saturday meeting. Tom's work at the bank ran parallel to Grace's. He had been meticulous in his documentation from the moment I had called him from the parking lot on that Monday. Every transaction had been logged with the date, amount, origin, and destination. He had identified the external account that received the transfers, a business account in the name of KTC Ventures, LLC, registered in Georgia, with Kevin Callahan listed as sole member. KTC Ventures had been incorporated 14 months ago, 1 month after I had given Kevin the $15,000 check. Tom said. When he showed me this, the incorporation date matters. It suggests the account was created specifically to receive funds from your accounts, not that it was an existing business account that happened to receive the transfers. I said, he planned it before he asked me for the loan. Tom said, the timing is consistent with that interpretation. The loan had been the test. KTC Ventures had been the infrastructure. The power of attorney had been the legal cover. The smart home system had been the monitoring tool. And the birthday speech in front of witnesses had been the setup for a medical legal process that would have made the rest of it very difficult to challenge. It had been built in layers. Over more than a year, I sat with that for an evening. The patience of it, the calculation, the fact that while I had been learning to cook for one and keeping the house up and visiting Jake and Emma in Millbrook, my son had been constructing a financial trap with the patience of someone who believed he had plenty of time and a father who would not see it coming. He was wrong about the second part. She said, for what? I said, Kevin called me this morning. He wants to have a family meeting. He says he's concerned about my care needs and wants to include a medical professional in the conversation. I believe he wants to have me assessed for cognitive incapacity in front of witnesses. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he wants to get it on record with a physician present so that when the mortgage application is reviewed, there's documented support for the claim that a guardian's signature was appropriate. I said, that's what I think. She said, when is the meeting? I said, Saturday. 2 in the afternoon. He said he'd arrange a neutral location. He suggested his friend's law office in Millbrook. Grace said, his friend's law office. Not a neutral location at all. I said, no. She said, I'll be there. I said, so will Tom. She said, Bob, do you want to tell me right now what else you're bringing? I said, I'm bringing 43 pages of transaction records, the revoked power of attorney, the mortgage application with the forged signature, and a recording device, which under Georgia's one-party consent law, I am fully entitled to operate. Grace was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, I'll see you Saturday. The night before the meeting, I could not sleep. I got up at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen. I stood in the dark for a while. Then I took Margaret's cast iron skillet down from the wall for the first time in 18 months. I held it with both hands. It weighed about 5 pounds. Black iron, seasoned over decades of Sunday cooking. Margaret had received it from her mother. Before that, it had belonged to her grandmother. It was the kind of object that carries other people's time in it. I set it on the stove. I found the container of bacon grease Margaret always kept in the refrigerator. I put a small amount in the pan and turned the burner on low and stood there watching the grease melt slowly and the pan heat evenly the way cast iron does, slow and sure and holding heat long after the flame drops. Kevin had told 12 people that I nearly burned down the kitchen. I had not nearly burned down the kitchen. I had singed a dish towel in October because I had left it too close to the burner while I was distracted. A singed dish towel. Kevin had mentioned it to Margaret's friend Carol, who had mentioned it to Kevin's friend, who had apparently mentioned it to Dr. Marcus Ellison, or to Kevin, who had relayed it to Dr. Ellison, as evidence of a pattern. From a singed dish towel to a physician's letter about cognitive decline. That was the measure of what my son had built. I stood at that stove and heated the skillet until it was ready. Then I made scrambled eggs at 2 in the morning and ate them standing up at the counter because Margaret always said the best eggs were the ones you ate too late in a quiet kitchen. She was right about that. She was right about most things. I washed the skillet, dried it, seasoned it with a thin coat of oil, and hung it back on the wall. Then I went to bed and slept 4 hours. Saturday arrived cold and bright for April in Georgia. I dressed in the clothes I used to wear to county emergency management presentations. Dark trousers, a button-down shirt, a sport coat, not a suit. Not dressed for a funeral or a courtroom. Dressed the way a man dresses when he wants to be taken seriously without appearing to be performing. I arrived at the Millbrook office of Derek Foss, attorney at law, at 1:55. Grace Chen was already in the parking lot. Tom Willis arrived 1 minute later. The three of us stood beside my truck and went over the plan one final time. Grace said, "Let Kevin drive the opening. Don't correct anything until I signal." Tom said, "I have the printed transaction records, the mortgage application, and the fraud alert documentation in the order we discussed." I said, "The recording device is on." We walked in together. The reception area was ordinary. 3 chairs, a desk with a young woman who looked up when we entered. Kevin was already inside a conference room, visible through a glass panel. He was standing, animated, talking to a man I did not recognize who was probably Dr. Marcus Ellison. Tina was seated. 2 other people I did not know were also seated. Kevin turned when he heard the door. His face did something complicated when he saw Grace Chen. And then again when he saw Tom Willis. He recovered quickly, the way practiced people recover, and came forward with his hand out. "Dad, I'm glad you're here." He looked at Grace and Tom. "I didn't realize you were bringing people," I said. "Grace is my attorney. Tom is my banker. I thought it made sense to have them." Kevin's smile stayed in place. He said, "Of course. The more the merrier." He said it the way you say something you do not mean. We went inside. Dr. Ellison introduced himself. 50-ish. Soft handshake. The slightly uncertain manner of a man who has been told a situation would be simple and is beginning to suspect it will not be. The 2 other people were introduced as Kevin's financial advisor and Kevin's personal attorney, Derek Foss, in whose office we were sitting. His home turf, his witnesses. Kevin organized the meeting with the efficiency of a man who has rehearsed it. He said he had called this meeting out of love and concern. He said that over the past year, he had noticed changes in his father's behavior that worried him. He listed them: the burning incident in the kitchen, the unlocked door, missed appointments, repeated questions, forgetting names. He delivered each item with practiced sadness, not accusation, concern. He said he had asked Dr. Ellison to be present because he wanted a professional opinion about whether some additional support structures might help his father remain independent. Dr. Ellison nodded and said he had reviewed the information Kevin had shared and had some observations he would like to discuss. Kevin leaned back slightly in his chair, the posture of a man who believes the next few minutes will go in his direction. I looked at Grace. She opened her folder. Grace Chen did not raise her voice. She did not change her expression. She spoke the way she always spoke, directly and without decoration. She said, "Before Dr. Ellison shares his observations, I'd like to address a few preliminary matters on behalf of my client, Robert Callahan." Derek Foss looked at Kevin. Kevin's financial advisor shifted slightly in his seat. Grace placed the first document on the table. She said, "This is a certified copy of a power of attorney, filed approximately 8 months ago, naming Kevin Callahan as holder. This is also a certified copy of a formal revocation of that power of attorney, executed by Robert Callahan, notarized and filed with the county register and all relevant financial institutions as of 8 days ago. The power of attorney is no longer valid. Kevin said, "Dad, that's not." Grace said, "I'm not finished." She placed the second document on the table. This is a mortgage application filed against Robert Callahan's primary residence 6 weeks ago. The application was filed using the now revoked power of attorney. It bears a signature purporting to be Robert Callahan's. Mr. Callahan did not sign this application and was not aware it had been filed. Dr. Ellison's pen had stopped moving on his notepad. Tom Willis placed a folder on the table. He said, "This is 12 months of transaction records from Robert Callahan's First Community Bank account. The highlighted entries represent 47 transfers totaling $34,220, made over 8 months, initiated through a mobile banking application connected to a device installed in Mr. Callahan's home." Kevin stood up. He said, "This is ridiculous. I manage my father's accounts because he asked me to." I said, "Kevin, sit down." He looked at me. Something in my voice made him sit. I said, "I did not ask you to manage my accounts. I did not make those transfers, and I did not sign that mortgage application." I looked at him steadily. "The smart home system you installed on my birthday includes a secondary data bridge device that mirrors activity from my home network to an external receiver. Earl Hutchins found it the night of the party. I have photographs and a written description from a man who spent 38 years as a licensed electrician." The room was very quiet. Kevin looked at Tina. Tina was looking at the table. Derek Foss said, in the careful voice of an attorney who has just understood that the ground beneath his feet is not what he thought it was, "Kevin, I need to speak with you privately." Kevin said. Derek said, "Now, Kevin." Kevin's financial advisor had already placed his notepad face down. Dr. Ellison quietly gathered his papers and put them back in his bag. He said, "I think perhaps I'm not needed here after all." He looked at me briefly, then looked away. He walked out. Grace said to Derek Foss, "We will be referring the transaction records and mortgage application to the Harlan County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division under Georgia Code Section 165, Financial Exploitation of an Elder." We wanted this meeting to occur first, so that Kevin had the opportunity to understand the situation fully before those referrals were made. Derek Foss looked at Kevin. Kevin's face had gone to the specific gray of a man who has been running a calculation and has just arrived at a number he did not expect. He said, "Dad, I can explain all of this." I said, "I know you think you can." He said, "I was trying to protect you. After Mom died, you were a mess. You couldn't manage anything. I was covering for you." I said, "Kevin, you filed a reverse mortgage on my house for $180,000. He said, "I was going to pay it back." That sentence. I was going to pay it back. The same thing he had said about the $15,000 check 14 months ago. I said, the $15,000, the 47 transfers, the mortgage application, the physician's letter from a doctor who has never examined me, the data device in my utility room. I looked at my son. This was not protection. This was a plan. Kevin looked at Tina. Tina said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I told you it had gone too far." Kevin said, "Tina," she said, "I told you months ago." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I told you when you filed the mortgage. I told you when you put that thing in the router." She looked up at me. "Bob, I'm sorry. I should have told you." The room was quiet again. Grace looked at me. I looked back. Then I looked at Derek Foss, who had the expression of a man who had not been told the full story before agreeing to host this meeting. I said, "Derek, I understand you were acting in good faith. I'm not making any referrals that involve your office. Derek nodded once, with visible relief. I stood up. Tom and Grace gathered their folders. I looked at my son one more time. Kevin was 47 years younger than me, in better physical shape, better dressed. He was sitting at a conference table with his hands flat on its surface, looking at a version of his father he had apparently not expected to meet. I said, "Jake and Emma deserve better than this. Whatever happens next, you remember that." Then I walked out. I want to tell you what happened inside that conference room in detail, because the details are where the story lives. Derek Foss's office had the particular atmosphere of rooms that are designed to intimidate through comfort. Dark wood, heavy chairs, a conference table that seated 10 and made 2 people at opposite ends feel like strangers. A credenza with framed professional certifications on the wall behind it. The kind of room that says, authority is already present here before anyone speaks. Kevin had chosen it deliberately. When Grace placed the first document on the table, the revocation of the power of attorney, Kevin looked at it the way people look at something they did not expect to encounter. Not surprise, exactly. The micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating in real time. He said, "Dad, that's not necessary. I've been using that document to help you. Nothing else." Grace said, "The document has been revoked." "That's not a discussion. It's a statement of current legal status," Kevin said. "Grace, with respect, I don't think you have the full picture of my father's situation," Grace said. "With equal respect, Kevin, I have been your father's attorney for 14 years. I have a somewhat complete picture." She placed the second document on the table, the mortgage application. Kevin's financial advisor, a man named Brett something, in his 40s with the slick surface of someone who sold confidence as a product, looked at the document and looked at Kevin. Something passed between them. A recalibration. Kevin said, "The mortgage application was filed to help Dad access liquidity he wasn't tapping. He's asset-rich and cash-poor. I was acting in what I believe to be his best financial interest," Tom Willis said. "Kevin, the account from which the funds were to be drawn shows $34,200 in transfers over 8 months, each initiated from a mobile device registered to your father but connected to network infrastructure you installed. Where did those funds go?" Kevin said, "Dad asked me to manage expenses while he was getting his feet under him after Mom's passing." I said, "Kevin, I am going to ask you to stop talking." He looked at me. I said, "Not because you're going to say something that makes this worse, although you are, because I want you to listen to what is actually happening in this room." He stopped talking. I said, "You built this, Kevin, piece by piece, over 14 months. The loan that tested whether I would give money without accountability. The power of attorney that gave you legal cover. The data device that let you monitor my accounts in real time. The physician's letter from a doctor who has never examined me. The birthday speech in front of 12 witnesses to establish a narrative about my decline. The meeting today with your attorney in this room to finalize the process." The room was very still. I said, "You are your mother's son. She would tell you that she sees the intelligence in what you built. And then she would tell you that she is heartbroken, that you pointed it at your family." Kevin looked at his hands. I said, "The neurological evaluation I completed last Tuesday at Harlan County Medical Center with Dr. Patricia Moore, board-certified neurologist, found no indicators of cognitive impairment across any measured domain. I have the written report in this folder. If you would like to compare it to the letter from Dr. Marcus Ellison, you will find them difficult to reconcile." Dr. Ellison, who had not yet left, placed his notepad face down on the table. I said, "Dr. Ellison, I am not naming you in the referral I have made to the Georgia Medical Board. That decision is based on my assessment of your involvement and not on any legal advice. I suggest you spend some time between now and whenever that board contacts you thinking carefully about what you knew and when you knew it." Dr. Ellison stood up without speaking and walked out. Derek Foss said, in the voice of a man doing professional damage control, "Kevin, I strongly advise you to stop speaking until you and I have had a private conversation." Kevin said, "Derek." Derek said, "Kevin, right now." The two of them stepped into the hallway. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see Derek speaking in the low, rapid voice of an attorney whose case has just changed shape. Brett, the financial advisor, quietly picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and said something about a scheduling conflict and left. Tina, who had said nothing since entering the room, looked across the table at me and said, "Bob, I'm so sorry." I said, "I know you are, Tina." She said, "I should have told you." I kept telling myself it would stop, that Kevin would stop it himself. I said, "When did you know?" She said, "About the transfers. From the beginning. I knew about the device in the utility room because Kevin described it to me as a monitoring tool. I told him it was too far. I told him twice. He said it was temporary." She pressed her lips together. "I want you to know that I did not know about the mortgage application until after it was filed." I said, "Do you know it now?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Then you understand that Jake and Emma are going to need at least one parent who makes the right choice in the next year. I hope that's you." She nodded. She did not cry, which I respected. Kevin came back into the room. Derek Foss came with him but did not sit. He stood near the door with his hands in his pockets, the body language of a man who has stepped back from a situation. Kevin sat down. He looked at me. He said, "Dad, I need you to understand something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I was going to put it back. All of it. I just needed time." I have heard those words before. Not in this context. In the context of 30 years of emergency management, where I had sat across from people who had made decisions under pressure that had cost other people something significant. People who genuinely believed, in the moment, that the harm they were causing was temporary, that the damage would be repaired, that the gap between intention and outcome would close before anyone noticed. The road to genuine harm is built almost entirely from temporary decisions. I said, "Kevin, you had 6 months to return the $15,000 loan. You did not return it. You had 8 months, during which you could have stopped the transfers at any point. You did not stop them. You filed a mortgage application for $180,000 on a house that is not yours." I said this quietly, not with anger, with the precise, even delivery of a man who has finished deciding something. I said, "That is not a plan to return what you took. That is a plan to take more." Kevin said nothing. I stood up. I said to Grace, "Are we finished here?" She said, "We are finished here." I said to Tom, "Thank you for coming." He said, "Of course, Bob." I picked up my folder. I walked to the door. I paused with my hand on the frame, the same way Kevin had paused at the door of my kitchen weeks later. There are gestures that complete things. I said, without turning around, Jake called me on a school night to apologize for something he had nothing to do with. Whatever comes next for you, Kevin, remember that. He is the best of you. Don't waste him. Then I walked out into the April sunshine and stood in the parking lot of Derek Foss's office in Millbrook, Georgia, and took a long breath. Grace came out behind me. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You handled that well." I said I had good preparation. She smiled. She looked like Margaret when she smiled. Not in her face, but in the quality of it. The smile of a woman who is satisfied without needing you to know she's satisfied. She said, "I'll file the referral this afternoon." I said, "I know." We shook hands. I got in my truck. I drove home to Harlan County, with the windows down. What happened next came in the specific, unhurried sequence of institutional consequence. The referral to the Harlan County Sheriff's Office was filed the following Monday. The assigned detective was a woman named Sandra Park, 41, who had worked financial crimes before moving to Harlan County and who went through the transaction records and mortgage application with the thorough, patient attention of someone who had seen this kind of case before. She called me on Wednesday and said, "Mr. Callahan, I want to make sure I understand the full picture before we proceed. Is there anything else you can tell me about the device in the utility room?" I had the photographs Earl had taken. I had Earl's written description. I had the device itself, which Earl had carefully removed and placed in a sealed bag. I provided all of it. Detective Park said, "The secondary device is potentially significant because it demonstrates premeditation. The transfers and the mortgage application could theoretically be argued as misuse of authority under a power of attorney, which is a civil matter. But installing a monitoring device to track your father's financial activity without his knowledge is a different category. Under Georgia Code Section 165102, financial exploitation of an elder person is a felony when the amount exceeds $5,000. $34,000 across 47 transactions was well above that threshold. The mortgage application added another layer, as did the physician's letter, which Detective Park described, in a careful, neutral voice, as potentially involving a third party who had knowingly submitted a misleading document. Kevin was charged 6 weeks after the Saturday meeting. Financial exploitation of an elder, filing a fraudulent mortgage application, unauthorized access to financial accounts. The charges were filed in the Harlan County Superior Court on a Tuesday morning. Kevin surrendered himself to the sheriff's office that afternoon, accompanied by a criminal defense attorney from Atlanta, who charged $400 an hour and who, according to Grace, immediately advised Kevin to cooperate with investigators in hopes of a negotiated resolution. Tina had already given a voluntary statement to Detective Park 3 days before the charges were filed. She had not known about the data device. She had known about the transfers and had raised objections that Kevin had dismissed. She had signed nothing and had no direct involvement in the mortgage application. Detective Park recommended to the district attorney that Tina not be charged based on the weight of her cooperation. The reverse mortgage application was voided by the lender upon notification from Tom Willis. The house was never at risk. The $15,000 check was a separate matter. It had been a gift, not a loan, regardless of how Kevin had described it. Grace advised me that attempting to recover it through civil action was possible, but would require sustained effort for a sum that, while significant, was not worth the additional cost and attention. I decided to let it go. The smart home security equipment was removed from my house by Earl on a Sunday afternoon, methodically and completely. He checked every room, every outlet, every network connection, and confirmed that nothing remained that had not been there before Kevin's birthday installation. When Earl was done, he stood in the kitchen and said, "You want a beer?" I said, "I want a cup of coffee." We sat at Margaret's kitchen table and drank coffee until the sun went down, and Earl told me about his fishing trip the previous weekend. And I told him about a call I had taken from Jake, my grandson, who had called to say he was sorry for what his father had done. That call from Jake had come 3 days after the charges were filed. He was 14. He had called from his own phone at 8 o'clock on a school night, and he had said, "Grandpa, I just wanted you to know that I don't think what Dad did was right, and I'm really sorry." I said, "Jake, none of this is your responsibility." He said, "I know, but I still wanted to say it." I said, "I appreciate that more than you know." He said, "Can I still come visit? Emma wants to know if we can still come visit." I said, "You can come anytime you want. This house is always open to you." He said, "Okay." A pause. "Grandpa, "Did you really burn down the kitchen?" I said. "I singed a dish towel." He laughed. The clean, uncomplicated laugh of a 14-year-old hearing an adult admit to a small, ordinary mistake. I said, "Your grandmother would have had something precise to say about that." He said, "What would she have said?" I said, "She would have said, 'Raymond, every cook burns something eventually. The question is whether you learned from it." He said, "I thought your name was Robert." I said, "It is. Your grandmother called me Raymond when she was making a point." He laughed again. Then he said, "Good night, Grandpa." I said, "Good night, Jake." Kevin's case was resolved through a negotiated plea agreement 7 months after the charges were filed. He pled guilty to financial exploitation of an elder and 1 count of filing a fraudulent document. The criminal defense attorney from Atlanta had worked hard for a reduced charge and a suspended sentence with restitution. The district attorney had been willing to negotiate based on Kevin's lack of prior criminal record and Tina's cooperation. The sentence was 3 years probation, mandatory financial counseling, community service, and full restitution of the $34,220. The restitution was paid in installments. Kevin sold the car and used the proceeds for the first payment. The remaining payments were structured over 18 months. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. Grace attended and represented my interests. She told me afterward that Kevin had spoken briefly before the judge and had said he was sorry, that he had made choices under financial pressure that he could not justify and did not expect his father to forgive. The judge had said, "Financial pressure does not authorize theft from a parent. It does not authorize deceiving a physician into writing a fraudulent letter. It does not authorize installing surveillance equipment in an elderly man's home. The fact that your father chose not to seek the maximum penalty available under the statute reflects a generosity you did not earn." Grace told me that last sentence. I asked her to write it down for me, which she did on a notepad from her office that I kept in my desk. The months after the sentencing had a different quality than the months before. Not easier, exactly, but clearer. I had spent 18 months after Margaret died in a kind of suspension, going through the motions of the life she and I had built together, in the space where she had been, without the person who had made the space make sense. And then I had spent 3 months in the specific focused tension of building a case and waiting to use it. And now, that was finished, and I was back in the house again. But something had changed. I was not suspended anymore. I started cooking again. Not complicated cooking. Margaret's recipes, from the notebook she had kept in the second kitchen drawer. Sunday chili, cornbread, the chicken and rice she had made when the kids from the neighborhood came over. I cooked them on Margaret's cast iron skillet, which I had taken down from the wall and left on the stove where it belonged. Kevin called in October. The first call since the sentencing in August. He said, "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but can we talk?" I said, "We can talk." He drove over on a Saturday afternoon. He looked thinner than he had at the birthday dinner. The easy confidence was gone. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded in the familiar gesture and looked at the table for a moment before he looked at me. He said, "I don't know how to start." I said, "The beginning is usually the right place." He said, "After Mom died, we were in a really bad position financially. I'd overextended on the house. Tina's business had a bad year. I had debt I'd been hiding from her." He paused. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I would fix it before anyone knew. And then the $15,000 loan was supposed to help, but it didn't really help. And then I thought if I just had access to some of your money temporarily, I could straighten everything out and pay it back before you noticed. He stopped. And then it kept going. And I kept telling myself I would fix it. I looked at my son, 37 years old. The same hands he had had as a little boy, folded on the table. The same posture. I said, Kevin, when you were 8 years old, you told me that you had not broken the back window of the shed. I knew you had. I knew because you had the same expression you have right now, which is the expression of someone who has practiced an explanation and knows it is not good enough. He said nothing. I said, I'm not going to tell you what I forgive and what I don't. That's not a conversation for today. Today, I just want to ask you one question. He said, okay. I said, does Tina know the full picture now? Everything. He said, yes. I said, and Jake and Emma, are they okay? He said, they're okay. Emma asks about you every week. I said, then here is what I'm going to tell you. I am not going to be your father in the way I was before, because that version of being your father allowed something to happen that I should have prevented. But I am not going to stop being your father. Those are two different things, and you need to understand the difference. He said, I understand. I said, Jake called me and apologized for something he had nothing to apologize for. He is 14 years old, and he called me on a school night and told me he was sorry. That is the kind of man he is becoming. Do not waste that. Kevin's eyes went bright. He pressed his lips together. I said, go home. Pay the restitution. Get the counseling. Show your kids what a person does after they have done something wrong. He stood up. He looked at the cast iron skillet on the stove. He said, you're cooking again. I said, your mother's recipes. He said, she would have hated all of this. I said, she would have. And she would have found a way to be right about something she told me years ago that I didn't listen to carefully enough. Kevin nodded once. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He said, Dad. I said, I know. He left. I stood at the stove for a while. The cast iron was warm from the morning. I picked up Margaret's notebook from the counter and found the page for her Sunday chili recipe. Dried beans, 2 cans of tomatoes, smoked paprika, cumin, a piece of dark chocolate that she said nobody would ever identify but everyone would taste. I started cooking. The restitution payments arrived on schedule for the first 8 months, and then began arriving slightly late, which Tom flagged and which Grace monitored. The lateness was not defiance. It was the natural consequence of a man who was genuinely rebuilding something real rather than the appearance of something real. Kevin had sold the car. He had also, according to Tina, accepted a position with a logistics firm in Millbrook that paid less than his previous work, but that had stability he had not had in years. Tina called me in December. She did not call to report on Kevin's progress. She called to ask if she could bring Jake and Emma to see me for the holidays. I said yes without hesitating. They came on the 23rd of December, all 3 of them without Kevin, who had not been invited and who understood, according to Tina, that the invitation would come later or it would not come, and that either outcome was the consequence of his own decisions. Emma was 11 and had Margaret's specific quality of stillness when she was interested in something. She sat at the kitchen table and watched me make cornbread from Margaret's recipe with the focused attention of a child deciding whether to ask a question or save it. She asked it. She said, Grandpa, why does that pan look so old? I said, because it is old. It belonged to your great-grandmother before it belonged to your grandmother. Before that, it belonged to someone before her. She said, is that where it's going to stay? On the stove. I said, that's where it belongs. She said, can I learn to cook with it sometime? I said, anytime you want. She nodded like a child making a note of something important. Then she went to find Jake, who had wandered into the living room to look at the photographs Margaret had kept on the side table. Photographs of Kevin as a child, of Tina and Kevin's wedding, of Jake and Emma at various ages. Margaret had arranged them in a line that told the story of the family from the outside, which was the only story photographs can tell. Jake stood in front of one of them for a long time. I came to stand beside him. The photograph was from a summer about 15 years ago. Kevin was 22. He was standing in the backyard, squinting against the sun, and he had his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she was laughing at something he had just said. It was the kind of photograph that captures a person when they do not know they are being photographed, which is when photographs tell the truth. Jake said. He used to be different. I said. He used to be more of himself. Jake said. What does that mean? I thought about how to say it honestly to a 14-year-old. I said, your grandmother used to say that the thing people lose when they start making bad decisions isn't their character. It's their access to their character. The character is still there. They just can't find the door anymore. Jake turned that over. He said, do you think he can find it again? I said, I think that's up to him. Jake nodded. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he went to the kitchen to help his sister set the table, which Emma had begun doing without being asked because she was that kind of child. I stood in the living room for a moment by myself. Outside the window, the cherry trees Margaret had planted were bare in December, just dark branches against a gray sky. In 3 months, they would bloom again. They did it every year, regardless of what happened to the people who lived inside the house. I thought about the year that had just passed. The birthday speech, Earl's discovery, Grace, and Tom. The conference room in Millbrook. The charges. The plea. The restitution. I thought about what it had cost. Not just financially, the specific cost of discovering that the person you raised had looked at the life you built and decided it was a resource to be accessed rather than a relationship to be honored. And then I thought about Jake setting the table in the kitchen, Emma asking about the cast iron skillet, Tina standing at the stove heating soup without being told where anything was kept because she had been in this kitchen enough times to know. The family was not what it had been. It was not going to be what it had been. But there was something in the kitchen right now that was real and present and worth protecting. That was enough. For that evening, it was enough. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the period between the birthday party and the Saturday meeting, because it speaks to something I have not said clearly yet. I did not tell Kevin I knew. Not that Saturday night when Earl showed me the photographs. Not that Monday when Grace read the power of attorney. Not Wednesday when Tom walked me through the transaction records. Not Friday when I reviewed Dr. Moore's neurological report and held it in my hands, knowing that the contrast between it and Dr. Ellison's letter was going to be very difficult for anyone in that conference room to explain. For 2 weeks, I carried what I knew in complete silence. People ask how you do that, how you sit across from someone who has been stealing from you and speak normally and make coffee and accept their phone calls, how you manage the distance between what your face shows and what your mind is doing. I will tell you how. 30 years in emergency management teaches you that the most important decisions are made before the emergency begins. The moment a fire is burning is not the moment to plan your approach. The planning happens before. The training happens before. The protocols, the equipment, the coordination, the communication plans, all of it happens before, so that when the fire is burning, the decisions are already made, and all that remains is executing them. I had 2 weeks to plan. I used every hour of them, and I had 30 years of practice staying calm in situations that were not calm. Walking into burning buildings requires a particular kind of discipline, not the absence of fear, because fear is information, and ignoring information in a burning building gets you killed. But the capacity to process fear without letting it determine your behavior, to feel the heat and know exactly what it means, and move through it anyway with your plan intact. I walked into Derek Foss's conference room the way I had walked into burning buildings, knowing what was in there, having done the preparation, moving with the plan intact. The difference was that this time, I was not rescuing strangers. I was rescuing the house I had built with my own hands. The pension Margaret and I had spent 40 years building together, and the future of 2 grandchildren who deserved a grandfather who was still standing. That was worth being calm for. That was worth the 2 weeks of silence. I have thought about whether I should have handled it differently, whether I should have called Kevin directly and confronted him, given him the chance to stop and return what he had taken before it became a legal matter. People ask me that sometimes. My answer is this. Kevin had 47 chances to stop. Every transfer was a choice. Every conversation we had in those 8 months was a moment when he could have said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." He had the power of attorney for 8 months and did not once ask my permission for any of the transfers he made under its authority. A man who is making a mistake stops when he realizes he is making a mistake. A man who has built a plan stops only when the plan stops working. Kevin's plan stopped working on a Saturday afternoon in Millbrook. That is when he stopped. I did not owe him a softer landing than that. What I owed, and what I chose to give, was the restraint not to destroy him entirely when I had the tools to do more damage than I chose to do. The physician's letter alone, pursued aggressively, could have resulted in professional consequences for Dr. Persidic Tindino, Ellison that might have affected his family and his staff and his long-term patients. I chose to file with the medical board and let that process run its course without pushing it further. Kevin faced charges that carried serious consequences. I did not push for the maximum available penalty. I gave my victim impact statement in writing and let the court determine the sentence. Those were choices, not gifts. Choices about the kind of man I wanted to be in the aftermath of something that could have made me bitter for the rest of my life. Margaret used to say that the difference between justice and revenge was whether you needed it to be witnessed. Justice happens whether anyone is watching. Revenge needs an audience. I did not need an audience. I needed my house, my accounts, and my granddaughter's ability to call me on a school night without it costing anyone anything. I have all 3 of those things now. The rest is details. Here is what I want to say to you before you go. Financial exploitation of elder adults is one of the most underreported crimes in this country. The Georgia Attorney General's office estimates that more than 60% of financial exploitation cases involve a family member. The victim does not report because the perpetrator is a son, a daughter, a sibling, a spouse. Because reporting means destroying something that was already damaged. Because the shame of being deceived by your own family feels, somehow, like it belongs to you. It does not belong to you. I was a fire chief for 30 years. I know something about fires. The most dangerous fire is the one that starts slowly, in a space where nobody is watching, building heat before it produces visible flame. By the time you see the smoke, the structural damage is already significant. The smart home system, the power of attorney, the physician's letter, the birthday speech in front of witnesses. Each piece looked ordinary on its own. Together, they were the architecture of a fire. The lesson I took from it is not that you should distrust the people who love you. It is that love and trustworthiness are not the same thing. A person can love you and still be capable of making decisions that harm you. And the people who love you are exactly the ones who know which doors are unlocked. If you are the person in your family who keeps things together, who absorbs the weight, who tries not to cause trouble even when trouble is being caused to you, I want you to hear this clearly. Get your documents in order. Know what you have signed. Have an attorney you trust. Review any legal document before you put your name on it. Know your bank statements. Check your accounts. Not because you should live in suspicion, but because your financial security is something you are allowed to protect, even from people you love. And if something feels wrong, say something. To someone outside the family, to an attorney or a banker or a friend who will look at the situation without the emotional investment that makes you want it to be fine when it is not fine. Earl Hutchins went to the utility room at my birthday party because something did not look right to a man who knows what things should look like. He could have said nothing. He told me, instead. That one conversation changed everything. Find your Earl. Now I want to ask you something before you go. Leave it in the comments. What would you have done if you had been in my position on that birthday? Would you have confronted Kevin that night, when you first found out? Or would you have done what I did, which was stay quiet and build the case first? And tell me where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. I want to know how far this story has reached. If someone in your life needs to hear this, send it to them. Not because revenge is the point. The point is never revenge. The point is that nobody gets to build a fire in your house and call it warmth. Share it. Subscribe if you haven't. And take care of the people in your life who are worth taking care of. Margaret's cast iron skillet is still on the stove where it belongs. I cook with it every Sunday now. She was right about the dark chocolate in the chili. I should have listened more carefully. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment and reflective purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. If any part of this story resonated with you, please look into the elder financial protection resources available in your state. The National Elder Law Foundation and your State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division are good places to start. Thank you for watching.